Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the compliment of your invitation and for the courtesy of your attention. I have 30 minutes to speak to you on a number of aspects, principally concerning the criminal justice system, and then, as long as I stick to that, about 15 minutes for questions after that. I appeared at your conference in this capacity 6 years ago. I actually did a couple of sessions when I was doing the pay review before that. And I've just published in July this year my 6th State of Policing report. And this is an address about the state of the criminal justice system, not just the police. And in my State of Policing report in July, I described the system as defective and dysfunctional. And I'll explain a little bit about that shortly. However, first I want to pay tribute to you and your colleagues, police officers all over the UK and their police staff counterparts, having spent the last 9 years in very intimate contact with policing at all levels. I know very well that policing is a very difficult job undertaken by committed, hardworking, compassionate individuals, highly professional, men and women who are brave and who every day take risks, because on the front line, no one knows what trouble will present itself that day. And sometimes the officer does not go home. And in the forefront of our minds are the individuals also and their families who have paid the ultimate price for them just doing their job. I wholly support the Protect the Protectors campaign to keep police safe and to bring to justice those who assault you. I also wish to place on record my understanding and appreciation of the strains which have intensified, the strains on the superintending ranks, who have faced in recent years very significant reductions in their numbers and consequently large increases in the spans of their responsibility. And those responsibilities are, of course, very heavy ones and quite unlike almost all of those, in fact, all of those in the private sector. The risks, not that some large corporation will suffer some commercial reverse or disadvantage, but the risks that a child will die, the risks that someone will be shot, the risk that someone will suffer a catastrophic and life-changing reverse as a result of crime, and so many others. The most senior operational rank has so far been heavily reduced. And with the increase in police officers now being planned by the government, I support the case for there being an appropriate uplift in the superintending ranks to relieve those pressures, as well as properly to reflect the enlargement of the workforce. Nothing else would be fair. And also, I acknowledge and say strongly that the resilience work that is undertaken by the association and others is of great importance. And I know that I will shortly be briefed by your leadership on that. Police reform took place in 2010 to 2018. It was the greatest amount of police reform since Robert Peel established the Met in 1829. And in many respects, it was essential. There were essential reforms to pay and conditions, especially moving from time-based service to skills and contribution-based pay. Establishment and now re-energization of the College of Policing under Mike Cunningham. Setting up the National Crime Agency. Reform of the Inspectorate, the establishment of the Inspectorate's Peel programme and now risk-based inspections, force management statements, super complaints, the replacement of ACPO with the National Police Chiefs Council, and other things. There have also been major reforms in criminal law and criminal procedures, including in matters concerning violence against women and girls, modern slavery and human trafficking, and other things. And of course, the budget cuts when they arrived, compelled forces to find efficiencies. But in some respects, and in too many respects, not all the efficiencies have been found and exploited, and more are needed. But they have to be realistic. Policing is ever-changing, from the recent protests where the Met had requested mutual aid for only, I think, the second time in recent years, to the threats from cyber and terrorism, to the significant increases in sexual offences. But there are always some significant areas where policing can improve. To be efficient, though, you need to invest. And invest means do it first, do it early, not afterwards, and invest in the right things and at the right times. And that includes, of course, technology, such as mobile electronic devices. We still have officers in some parts of the country using paper and pencil, having to key it in at the station at the end of the shift on an insufficient number of forced laptops and much else besides. That is intolerable, and it is a waste of public money and a frustration, an obstacle on police officers being able to do their jobs. There is virtually no use of artificial intelligence and machine learning, even though that intelligence, those techniques are in widespread use in the commercial sector. Officers and staff in too many respects are still having to read every page of downloaded data from electronic devices that can, as you all know, run into thousands of pages. The average iPhone can produce 5,000 pages, and the average household has something like 7 or 8 or 9 individual electronic devices, and they might all have to be interrogated. And these things have to be looked at because there may be relevant evidence, whether it's incriminating or exculpatory, on those devices. Disclosure requirements are of enormous importance, and these things just make it a much bigger job. I used to be a partner in a City of London law firm, and my former partners, are using this technology today to do commercial due diligence on company acquisitions and many other things. And they can read, this software can read millions of pages in a tiny amount of time, a tiny fraction of the time that it used to take in the days when I began my career 40 years ago, when you had to read everything and make notes and you got tired and made mistakes. These things can do this in a flash. And if it can be used, and there are several applications out there, all of them commercially available. You don't have to design them. You don't have to do it the Met way, which is, thanks very much, we'll design our own. That's not on. You can buy this stuff off the shelf. It's pretty much cheap as chips, and you can use it and teach it to understand texts, codes, all the rest of it, misspellings, and then you can get that information. Why isn't it used now? I simply don't know. I've had demonstrations of 8 different systems in my office, just online. And if that is possible in the commercial sector, then why would you not use it in the most essential safety-critical public service of all? Officers are still struggling to download CCTV effectively. And worse is often to come with aging technology and lack of integration with the court service. In some cases, exhibiting evidence in court still uses 20th century technology, which is not fit for the 21st century. Since 2010 and since later, there has been an exponential increase in the complexity of crime and the advances of technology. And these things make a great deal more work for police and prosecutors, as I've said. And that's not where we were in 2010 or even later. It's essential that officers and staff have the time and the skills to do this job well. The old saying is justice delayed and is justice denied. And in too many cases, under our present system, justice never arrives at all, whether for the victim, for the accused, or for the witnesses. The public have increasing demands on the police service, and those demands have grown, and they will not reduce. And the face and the complexity of demand is changing. As I've mentioned, social media, but also online fraud. And technology now facilitates crime, but there has also been a rise in crime in prisons and, of course, violent crime on our streets in general. Now, of course, there is a cost to providing an effective and efficient criminal justice system. and we cannot have a criminal justice system on the cheap. As the Commissioner of the Met, Dame Cressida Dick, from this morning, as she said in June this year, crime today has 4 distinctive and distinguishing aggravating characteristics. Its volume, its complexity, encryption, and speed. And the police have to get ahead of that. And meeting that intensified and complex demand requires strong leadership and investment. Some forces can improve on their efficiency. Everyone can become more efficient. But others are struggling to meet even basic demand. And they're constantly striving, and indeed it's essential they do, to do things better and more cost effectively and to greater effect. And that is the only way in which the police service will meet the demands that it will face in the years to come. And what we now need more than ever before is single system operation. Crime is no longer predominantly local. The 43 force model, designed in the 1960s and implemented in 1974, is no longer working as it should. And forces, too many forces, are still operating in an insular way. Collaborations are failing or collapsing. The Devon and Cornwall and Dorset merger cracked. This model is 50 years old. It's policing based on an old system for a very, very different world. The time has now come for the Home Office to step forward and to use its influence and also its unique legal powers to remove the barriers to cooperation and single system operation, whether on a regional or national basis, and to establish that true single system. I'm not talking about redrawing the map and merging police forces. Dame Vera Baird yesterday said she had the scars. I've also talked at length to Dennis O'Connor, who did a major report on this in 2005, and also Charles Clarke, who had his pen poised to sign the statutory instruments. You don't need primary legislation to redraw the map, to turn 43 forces into 17. And there were a number of reasons why that didn't go ahead. I'm not talking about redrawing the map. I'm talking about establishing, through a 43 force collaboration agreement called the Network Code, which is in my drawer, and I will be consulting on it soon, to ensure that where forces should cooperate, either on a regional and national basis, they will. And not just because they feel like it, but because they have to. You'll see it soon. I'm pleased to say that the Home Office now recognises the case for them doing more. And the Prime Minister is on the case, and the new Home Secretary too. Along with Martin Hewitt of the NPCC, Mike Cunningham, the College, Lynn Owens of the NCA, Cressida Dick from the Met, Katie Bourne of the APCC. We met just last month in the new National Policing Board, and I have to say I thought it was an enormously constructive meeting. It was not a photo opportunity, and there was a lot of very valuable stuff discussed there. But there is no time to lose, none at all. Better collaborations, joined up working, and importantly, interoperability of technology and a number of other functions. Those are critical to improving the service, and they can and should be achieved without structural reform. I said in my State of Policing report that the criminal justice system today is defective and dysfunctional. What did I mean by that? Well, hands up who thinks it isn't. The state of prisons, recently described by the Chief Inspector of Prisons, Peter Clarke, in July this year as deeply troubling, with jails plagued with drugs and violence, appalling living conditions, and a lack of access to rehabilitative activity. Prison libraries locked out of use. Prisoners spending far too long in their cells, not having enough time in terms of training, and of course they go into this circle. The collapse of probation. In February this year, Dame Glenys Stacey, who recently left as Chief Inspector of Probation, said the probation system had buckled under the strain. Appalling inefficiencies and failures in prosecutions, with inexcusable delays in bringing cases to court and disgraceful late changes to charges, with prosecutors given inadequately prepared papers at the last minute, causing disruption and delays to trials and injustices to the accused, to the complainants, and to the witnesses. Dame Vera said yesterday that the appetite of people who have been through the criminal justice system, for example, as witnesses or victims, almost half of them would never do it again. That is a disgraceful indictment on our criminal justice system, and it must change. And it doesn't stop there. The decay in our courts, the physical fabric of the building is deteriorating before our eyes. Injustices in the waste of court time. 500 courts closed, court hours cut, courts standing idle when trials are being delayed and accused persons and victims and witnesses are waiting a year and 2 years just to get the trial done. And as Cressida Dick also said recently, the courts are emptying and detection rates are woefully low. And we've also heard very recently about the severe threats to justice by the funding of criminal defense work and prosecution work. And the voices of the very recently retired president of the Queen's Bench Division, who is the head of the criminal justice, as you know, and the last president of the Supreme Court and the last Lord Chief Justice, those voices must be heard and heeded. The access to justice for everyone, the accused, the victim, witnesses, everyone, it is essential. And yet, in too many respects, it is the preserve only of large corporations, the very wealthy, or the very, very poor. So why has the criminal justice system come to this state? Well, funding cuts are the basic answer. And the fact that, unlike health and education, there are very few votes in criminal justice. Policymakers and others pay too little attention to criminal justice. That is, unless and until their lives, or people close to them, have their lives touched by it, whether as victims, witnesses, or accused. And then the failures and the inefficiencies and the injustices of the system appear to them in stark and shocking terms, but by then, of course, for them, it's too late, and they have to endure it. Hands up who hasn't read The Secret Barrister? One. A smattering. Well, do read it. In all my discussions with former colleagues in the legal profession, senior judges, prosecutors, and others, there's not one word of exaggeration in that book. Not one word. So what's my locus as Chief Inspector of Constabulary to say all these things about the wider criminal justice system? Well, I would expect it would be easily apparent. They have these things, a severe knock-on effect on the police, on their morale, and their ability to do the jobs which they are committed to do. The strain on officers and staff are now very severe, and these are intensified by the frustrations of the failures of the system. Some officers are being run ragged, far too many of them, and they are facing severe dangers on the streets and elsewhere, as I said earlier. Now, we have the recruitment of 20,000 new police officers and, in addition to that, the associated police staff to support them. And there will be new pressures on other parts of the criminal justice system, on prosecutors, the courts, prisons, and probation. Now, of course, if the recruitment and deployment of the 20,000 is done perfectly, and the right people are recruited and are 100% successful in achieving the objectives of Peel's first principle, prevention, then there won't be any need for anyone else in the criminal justice system or any additional people in the criminal justice system, because they will have been supremely successful in prevention, which is your primary purpose. But of course, that won't happen perfectly. Hardly anything happens perfectly. And there will be increased pressure on the system. So in order to properly assess the true pressures, and that includes future pressures on the system, it's necessary to have reliable information about demand, about condition, capacity, capability, performance, serviceability, efficiency, and security of supply. All well-managed enterprises need to know those things: future demand, as far as it can be predicted. Nobody's expecting perfection. All predictions are wrong. The question is, how wrong? But future demand, asset stewardship and efficiency and resources. Now that information comes in an innovation with which you are all familiar, I'm certain, in the form of force management statements, which is an instrument borrowed and now adapted by the inspectorate from the world of economic regulation, from which I come. The force management statements are now in their third year, and they are proving successful after a certain amount of harumphing and worse from some quarters. Those voices have not died down completely, but they are substantially muted. And of course, there is more work to be done to achieve their full operation and their highest practicable degree of standardization, respecting local conditions, and so comparability and utility. But by measuring all demand on the police and the state of the assets of the police and how those assets will be used to meet the demand, the statements reveal an essential truth, which is that the police cannot ever meet all demand. And they therefore compel the public, through their elected representatives, to make a determination of what they want the police to do, and to what standard they want it done, and what they are prepared to pay efficient forces to prioritize, and what they want the police not to do. And that, of course, has a knock-on effect to the other public services and agencies whose primary purpose is to deal with the causes of crime and disorder and to prevent. Prevention is not, as we all know, only the job of the police. Indeed, it should be the last thing that happens before the offense is committed. Health, education, housing, social services, so many things can intervene to prevent things going wrong, the diversion of young people from crime, and so on. Early childhood experiences, adverse experiences in childhood. I was in Wales recently. My staff officer, Carl Williams, is a Welsh officer. I have been to Wales more times than I've been to any other part of the country since he started working for me. That's impressive work that's taking place in South Wales and Gwent and in other parts of the country. But force management statements are going to expose, and they do expose, essential truths. And I'm going to take you to a story. It'll take a couple of minutes. As was mentioned, I used to be the economic regulator for the railways. I was appointed to that job 20 years ago by John Prescott. I was appointed to this job by Theresa May, so those are two opposite ends of the political spectrum. And one of the things I had to do was to determine how much money the railway infrastructure provider, first Railtrack and then Network Rail, would require, if it were efficient, to meet its obligations, to meet future demand, projected future demand in the following 5 years. In October 2000, I increased the financial settlement of Railtrack from 10 to 14.8 billion pounds. Almost immediately after that, the Hatfield rail crash took place. 4 men died, 70-odd people were injured, and it led to a collective, what Alistair Morton at the time called a collective nervous breakdown of the railway industry, severe operational failures. That led to a political attack by the government on Railtrack, which was unconstitutional and illegal. I'll tell you that story another time. Including a threat by government to extinguish my independence by emergency primary legislation if I stood in their way. I did stand in their way, but the top management of Railtrack were too stunned, I'll use that word, to resist. But then I had to reassess what the network required because we didn't know, because Railtrack didn't know, what was the condition of their assets. What was the condition, capacity, capability, serviceability, performance, efficiency, and security of supply of those assets? You see the crossovers. And so we did an additional review, and Alistair Darling was by then the Secretary of State for Transport, and I went to see him about 6 weeks before I announced my decision. And it's important for you to know it was my decision, not his. And it was not the Treasury's decision. Under the law at the time, they changed it after I did this, it was my decision to determine how much money the railway would have. And I went to Alistair Darling and I said, unless you exercise the powers you have to reduce the intensity of demand on the network, then the increase from the 14.8 billion that I'd allocated a year and a half before is going to be a further 7.4 billion pounds over 5 years, taking it up to 22.2. And Alistair Darling got quite agitated about that because he was democratically elected and I wasn't. I thought my democratic legitimacy came from an act of parliament, which is the highest level of democratic legitimacy. And I said, look, if the Treasury get their way and Network Rail, the successor to Railtrack, is going to have no more money than Railtrack had under the 14.8 billion pound settlement, then this is how you are going to have to reduce the intensity of demand on the network. You're going to have to close 25% of the network. Nothing in Scotland apart from Edinburgh and Glasgow, nothing in Wales apart from Cardiff. You're going to have to reduce the amount of traffic, freight and passenger on the remaining network by a further 25%. You're going to have to cut all enhancement expenditure, so nothing new. There's going to be a very significant increase in renewals and a deterioration in performance because things are going to wear out and break more often. And you're going to have to see a 6% year-on-year real increase in passenger fares. And Darling said to me, I'm not standing up in the House of Commons and announcing all that. And I said, no, I didn't think you would. But that's what an efficient operator requires to meet that projected 2% a year, year-on-year demand, increases in intensity of the network. That's what an efficient operator requires. Because you can't have 100% of demand met for 70% of its efficient cost. You just can't. You can't get a quart out of a pint pot. Those are the economic realities. And as an independent economic regulator, my job was, of course, to take these decisions on hard economic and engineering facts without regard to any political considerations. So I said, you've got 6 weeks to tell me, are you going to reduce the intensity of the use of the network, or to what extent are you going to do it? Because otherwise, I'm going to increase the financial settlement by a further 7.4 billion. Radio silence from the Department of Transport, so I put the money up. That is the economic reality. The same thing happens in other public services. You can't have 100% of whatever it is you want for 70% of its efficient cost. And that is the the fact that the criminal justice system faces. I also want to say that street violence is a major problem. It's not to say it's a new problem, but it does get a great deal of attention, and far too many people are dying on our streets. Is it more than in Victorian times? I simply don't know. But it is at an unacceptable level. Any death is one too many. Last year we saw a 19% rise in violent crime in England and Wales. Homicide is the highest it's been since 2007. And also the circumstances of fear and risk and injuries and death are unacceptable. So prevention, Peel's first principle, as I mentioned earlier, is essential. And that does mean coping with the causes of crime, chaotic families, people being drawn into crime at a young age, and all the rest of it. But it also means catching offenders and locking them up for a long time. So it is responsibility of all those public services, and it is essential that we address those problems and address them as efficiently and as effectively as possible. So, in conclusion, for the UK to retain its well-deserved, world-renowned reputation in policing, the difficult questions that I have raised need to be answered. I believe the political will is there to answer those things, but it is of enormous importance that the decisions that are made in relation to the uplift, the 20,000 additional police officers and corresponding additional employment of police staff, that those things are done wisely and well. The Inspectorate is its usual function is to look at what has happened after the event. It might be a year, it might be 18 months, it might be longer after the event, and tell people how well it went or where things had gone wrong. The offer I've made to the Minister, which he has accepted, is that the Inspectorate, with enormous volumes and quality of information which we have from every police force in the country and the National Crime Agency, we could be more proactive, if invited to do so, in analysing what has worked and where this money could be best spent in live time, whilst the decisions are being made by ministers and others, rather than our coming along afterwards and criticising. And I think that that is a very welcome development in our relationship with the Home Office and with the police service, and I'm very pleased that that advice has been, that offer of advice has been accepted. Without the fundamental changes that I have described, I think it is increasingly likely that the police will be unable to meet the demands that are being placed on them. But with the reforms in question, no doubt improved after consultation with others, I think that we can ensure that the challenges and the problems of the police are significantly reduced, especially in the current political environment. That's all I want to say to you. I apologize for not giving you any more legal jokes, but I think we had enough of those yesterday. And I now have 12 minutes, I think, in which to take any questions if there are any.
Well, Sir Thomas, thank you so much. You can sit down or stay at the lectern, whichever you're more comfortable with. I've got loads of questions have been coming in on the app, but I'm going to open the floor to questions as well, but I will definitely get to the most popular questions, if not all of them. Does anybody want to start off with a question in real life, or have you sent your questions all in via go to Ian? Can we get a microphone to Ian at the front? Thank you. Or maybe you're still mic'd up, actually.
About the significant pressure on resources across policing as well as inadequacies in other agencies. Is there a juxtaposition between these plain facts and the expectations from HMIC that forces should reach outstanding?
Everybody wants to be the best. There was a conversation a number of years ago between a chief constable who was told that his force was being rated requires improvement in relation to child protection. And the chief constable in question was absolutely furious with my colleague HMI who had been leading that inspection. Of course, we do not require improvement. Don't you understand the difficulties we have? Yes, we've looked at it very, very carefully. How many other forces have got requires improvement? And the answer was 34. And so his reaction was, well, that's all right then. That's not all right. Just being in the median, just being below the line because most of the others are below the line, really isn't good enough. Everybody should aspire to be the best. We don't expect forces to become outstanding. We hand out those grades very sparingly. Not because we want to ration them. I mean, we'd love it if everybody was outstanding. But everyone should aspire to be the best. Even with the austerity years and all the other pressures that the police have faced, it should be noted that the Inspectorate has seen a steady improvement in efficiency and effectiveness of police forces despite those things. But of course, what we want is for people to be as good as they can possibly be. But no, we don't demand outstanding, but we aspire to it. It's your police and crime commissioners who demand it.
Right, I'm going to rattle through some of the questions that have come through on the app, starting off with one on the network code concept. The questioner says, having seen a fairly chaotic collaborative landscape and the hokey-cokey of some forces joining and leaving these arrangements, these alliances are held together or not based on personalities. How will this work with the operational independence of chief constables and locally elected and often parochial PCCs?
Well, it'll work because it'll be well designed. I've been a lawyer for 40 years. I've worked for 25 of those 40 years. I've worked in some of the most complex joint ventures all over the world, in the energy industry, in the transport industry, in other essential services all over the place. And
do you accept the general premise of the questioner saying that, as they see it, it's based on the personalities and hokey-cokey?
Well, sorry, in too many respects it has been, but this one won't be. So these things need to be well designed and not drawn up by people who sort of start with a clean piece of paper and look at the one done next door, which is of course replete with compromises and so on. I mean, the collaboration agreement for air support is one of the most ineptly drafted contracts I've ever seen in my life. And we criticize it very severely. So it shouldn't be dependent on personalities. There will have to be 90 plus signatures on this thing. It is a pooling of sovereignties. And some of the most enlightened PCCs and of course chief constables have said, okay, I know I'm giving something up because I'm accepting the principle of qualified majority voting, different percentages for different qualities, different kinds of decision. And I might be in the minority. But what I am giving up is of lesser value than what I'm going to get back, which is a higher degree of standardization. At the moment, the joint venture, which is the police, is a 100% agreement joint venture. You need 100%. If everybody's going to do it the same way, everybody needs to agree. But even then, that's not an agreement that is binding. Because 6 months later, 12 months later, the Chief Constable of Barsetshire can just say, we don't want to do it anymore. And they just drop out. The network code will be a contract. It'll be a Section 22, a collaboration agreement, fully consulted upon and properly designed. The operational independence of chief constables will not be compromised because it will be an act of independence to sign the thing. And ditto the PCCs. I think that we're going to get a very high degree of acceptance of this thing. And what it does do, of course, is it contains a mechanism for its own modification. So as experience grows, it can be modified over time.
Okay, I'm going to take the conversation on to chief officers. 43 chief officer teams in England and Wales. This question says, the only rank not to suffer reduction in numbers in the last decade. How will government redraw the policing map with the current PCC structure and arguably self-interested chiefs? Well,
the reason that there have been no reductions in chief constables and deputy chief constables is the Police Act 1996 says you have to have, every force has to have a chief and a deputy. I think the question goes further, which is why do we have so many forces? I think I addressed that at some length in my remarks. Our PCC is going to be the blockage to this. There will be some reluctant ones, but I believe that we are on the way to a much more rational and coherent system.
So despite the fact it's enshrined in law, do you agree with the general principle there are too many of them, of that rank?
Well, not as long as you've got 43 forces, you have to have 43 chiefs. That sounds like a political answer.
A little bit, yes.
Do we need 43 forces? No, of course you don't need 43 forces. Some forces are very, very small indeed. But I'm not advocating redrawing the map because I think we can redraw the map in terms of the flow of information and intelligence and doing things the same way in another way. There's another way of getting everybody to do things the same way, respecting local circumstances and with exemptions and exceptions for and transitional arrangements and all those sorts of things, because under Section 53A of the Police Act 1996, the College of Policing can propose to the Secretary of State individual practices and procedures which must be followed by police forces, and the Secretary of State may only refuse to make a statutory instrument in those terms. The terms proposed by the college drafts it, if it is unlawful to do so, or it would impede efficiency and effectiveness in the police, or it would otherwise, for some other substantial reason, be wrong to do so.
So the college is where the lobbying should be happening?
The college has far more power than I think is realised.
All right. With the benefit of hindsight, this question is, what are your reflections on your original police review? Would you change any of the recommendations you made?
Yeah, I wish I'd gone further.
In what way?
Well, I think that I would have hoped that we would have been able to go to short service for police officers on the military model, but I'm afraid European directives meant that we couldn't.
Could Brexit change that?
Yeah, it could. I don't think it will. But at the moment, we don't need a mechanism for compulsory severance of police officers because we're just about to hire 20,000 more of them. But I think that one of the things I regret is not a recommendation I made, but a recommendation that appears to have been accepted by Parliament and enacted, and then, in too many respects, disregarded. And by that I mean the abolition of the Police Negotiating Board and its replacement by the Police Remuneration Review Body. Because one of the principal recommendations that I made in that review, there was direct entry, skills-based pay, and so on, is how constables can click up the pay ladder. What used to be 10 points, it's now 7, but there were thresholds which they had to pass in order to get to the next rung. And for the last 7 years, I think that the police chiefs have been too timid in insisting on the establishment of that final skills-based test, which officers have to go through. And as a result, through some extraordinarily skillful operations by the Police Federation and others, they have effectively recreated the Police Negotiating Board and disregarded the Police Pay Review Body. And I think that's deeply regrettable.
Can that be reversed?
Well, it's in statute. They're just not paying much attention to it. Maybe that's the way of politics these days.
I'm going to open the floor up again. Excellent. We can get a microphone to that chat. Anybody else? Because I can get the microphone to you to save a bit of time. No, sir.
Thank you. So, Tom, some months ago you gave evidence to the Thomas Commission in Welsh Government, and that is due to report their findings in the coming weeks. Would you like to share your thoughts in relation to what the Welsh Government are looking at as far as devolution of policing and criminal justice to Welsh Government?
I went to Cardiff with 2 of the other criminal justice chief inspectors to give evidence to the Commission on Criminal Justice, headed by Lord Thomas of Cumgaeth. Is that right? My staff officer will tell me. Not bad. Okay. The former Lord Chief Justice. Devolution has worked in the fire service, but in policing, I think that whilst national considerations of the kind being addressed by the Welsh Government are of very considerable importance, the direction of travel really ought to be towards a single England and Wales, single system operation in England and Wales, rather than further fragmentation.
Now I've got 1 minute and 10 seconds, or rather you've got 1 minute and 10 seconds to answer my final question, which I know is asking a lot, but it is. I think this is given what you said about you can't do everything with limited resources. This questioner says, what do you feel the police should not be doing, and how can we stop doing it?
Well, there are lots of things they shouldn't do. But it's not true to say that people with mental ill health who are out in the, who are causing disorder and alarm is nothing to do with the police, because of course there may be, the purpose of the police is not only to deal with crime. It may not be a crime, but it may be disorder. But nevertheless, there is a need for health, education, social services, and other public sector agencies to do what they are paid to do and not shunt demand onto the police, which is the service that will never say no. It's an unacceptable burden. It's demand shunting, it's throwing things across the fence, and it should stop. But that will require proper funding of those other public sector agencies. They're not demand shunting to the police because they can't be bothered to do it. They're doing it because they don't have the resources themselves. I think multi-agency working has in many parts of the country been extraordinarily successful, particularly in protection of the vulnerable, and I think there needs to be an intensification of that.
Not bad at all. As we said, we were really getting down to some nitty-gritty today, and I think whilst not exactly cheerful on many accounts, that was an incredibly interesting and stimulating discussion and presentation and speech. Please would you show your appreciation for Sir Tom Winsor.